Today's video is all about a bag of flour and the bread we're going to make from it. This isn't an ordinary bag of flour. In fact, you can't buy flour exactly like this. Not very easily anyway. You might notice the label on this bag of flour has been a little bit scrawled on because this is not an ordinary bag of flour. This is not something you can get very easily. To tell you the whole story about this and to lead us into the bit where we're going to make some bread out of this, I'm going to hand you over to VoiceOver Shrimp. We decided to take a little overnight break and spend a day, a night and a morning in Lyme Regis. This is a popular location for fossil hunting, but the tides on the day of our visit were not especially large or aptly timed for that. And that was okay because there's plenty else to do there. We wandered about the promenade, enjoying the waves. We strolled up and down Broad Street, which is filled with some really interesting shops. Quite a few of them were selling lovely food. We bought some pasties and walked out along the Cobb, enjoying the views across Lyme Bay, admiring turnstones and fishing boats. And when we got to the end, we sat and ate our lunch out there under the watchful eyes of the herring gulls. We visited the town museum, which was fascinating, but I can't show it to you because of restrictions about recording inside. It's worth a visit, lots of local history, including a lot about Mary Anning, possibly the town's most celebrated resident. It has some spectacular fossils from the Jurassic coast and lots of other things related to history and archaeology and paleontology. We also went to Town Mill, which is an ancient water mill, and there's been a mill on this site for much longer than the current building, at least as far back as the Domesday Book. The current mill building being established later in the 14th century. And it was a working mill for a long time, but it fell into disrepair in the early 20th century. It was rescued from dereliction and threat of demolition in the 1990s and restored by a group of local volunteers, and it's now run as a working museum. There is a good deal more to see inside than I will show you in this video, and that's intentional. If I showed you everything, there might be no reason for you to go there in person, and that would be a shame for many reasons. There's a wealth of information and exhibits on 3 different floors, and there are also some hands-on bits too where you can try grinding grain by hand-powered methods. Entry to the mill is free of charge, but there is a shop where you can buy flour that's been traditionally stone ground on site, as well as books and some kitchen stuff. I think this free-to-enter model is really great because it means if you're there in Lyme Regis and you have the time, there's really not much reason not to go and see the mill. There was, of course, no way I was going to be leaving the place without buying at least one bag of their flour. I expect that's the way things play out for a lot of visitors. We were there as soon as the mill opened in the morning, and while Paul, the miller, was setting up for the day's work. He talked us through the details of how the whole apparatus works, including the adjustment of gap between the millstones. And all of this needs to be carefully adjusted so as to result in a good grind and fine flour. They mill on different days wheat, rye and spelt grains. On the day we visited, it was wheat. Here he's going to open the sluice, and that will set the overshot water wheel running. Let's just watch that for a moment.
With the wheels, it will take maybe 4 or 5 buckets. And when it starts, it will go off fast because it's got full buckets. But as they go around, the ones behind are going past the water a lot quicker. So I get a lot less water in, so then it will slow down. Hopefully it will slow down to a sustainable rate rather than slow down and stop. Right.
Once the water wheel's turning, the building feels like it comes alive with this powerful, deep rumbling that you half hear and half feel. The stone's turning, and there's a mechanism called a damsel which shakes this hopper called a shoe to feed the grain into the eye of the millstone, a little at a time. And down on the floor below, the milled flour begins to appear out of the chute. As the miller explains, the gap between the 2 millstones needs to be very carefully adjusted, and that's all done from down here. Too big a gap between the stones and the flour will be coarse. Too small a gap and it may jam up or overheat and cause the flour to be compressed into hard lumps. The flour is collected and tested by just rubbing it between the fingertips to feel for the correct fine consistency. This does mean that a bit of the output at the very start of milling is typically a lot rougher or coarser than the flour that's produced when everything's properly dialed in, and this initial milling is set aside. But from the moment I saw that slightly coarse flour, almost more like meal than flour, I wanted to try baking with it. I had to get some. The miller was kind enough to give me a bag of this coarse initial discard meal in exchange for a small donation towards the upkeep of the mill, and that is the bag of flour I showed you at the start of this video. You can, of course, buy bags of finely and properly milled wholemeal wheat, spelt or rye flour in the gift shop at the mill entrance, and I did also buy a bag of rye flour. But the wheat meal I've got is coarse and rustic, and that makes it, I hope, special. And I want to make a loaf of bread that I hope will be also rustic and interesting and special. So that's a little glimpse of Town Mill in Lyme Regis, and if you're ever in the area, I thoroughly recommend a visit. There is also on site in the restored mill complex a small brewery. I bought a couple of bottles of their ale. There's also a restaurant, an assortment of workshops and other places where artisans and artists are creating art, pottery, jewellery and cards and pictures from pressed seaweeds. I'll link in the video description to the mill's website where you can see more details of everything. So that's where that bag of flour came from. Now let's go over to Kitchen Shrimp to try to turn that coarse wheat meal into a loaf of bread. So this is that flour. This is actually wholemeal wheat flour, and it's a little bit coarse because it's from the start of the milling. It's not what you would normally buy. It's not actually what you normally desire to buy. But I had this idea that if we take this rough flour, we can probably make a loaf of bread that might be quite old-fashioned, quite ancient in its characteristics. That's my hope and plan anyway. Now I'm going to sift the flour that I use here because I want to have a look and see what the coarser particles look like. So we're going to have 500 grams of flour. I'll probably do this in 2 batches. Exactly 250 grams to start with. So obviously there I'm sifting out the much finer stuff, which is mostly white flour. And we're quite quickly reaching a point where not much more is coming through. So we've got some lovely fine, mostly, as I say, white flour there. But what we've got left in here is not bran, it's meal. This is actually quite coarse, and when you rub it between your fingers, you can feel the slight grittiness of the grains. I'm going to keep on sieving until nothing else will go through this fine sieve. Yeah, so some quite coarse meal there, but that's fine. It's not fine, it's coarse. That is what I want. Now, I'm not sieving this to get it out, I was just sieving it to show you what it looks like. So actually that is all going to go back in there. And perhaps now you can actually see the contrast between those two different meals. Right, we'll do the other half of the flour. So another 250 grams. So we've got a total of 500 grams of flour there. And I'm going to make a sourdough bread here. And I've got a sourdough culture that I started using some of that flour. You may have noticed at the start that this bag of flour wasn't completely full. And so all I did is mixed some of that flour with some water and left it. And over the course of a few days, it's developed its own little starter culture there. You can see it's frothing away quite merrily. I've dealt with starting sourdoughs in different videos before, so I will link to one of those here because this video is not primarily about sourdough. So I'll link to one of these here if you want to see that process. But we're going to be using this sourdough starter to make this bread. And just to have a little sniff, it smells sour and beery and lively. All we need in there, apart from the flour and the water and obviously the yeast which is supplied by that sourdough, is a little bit of salt. So I'm going to put about 10 grams of salt in there. And I'll just mix everything together. It's a bit of straw or something there. We'll just have that out. So yeah, this really is quite rough and ready, this flour, but I'm hoping that we'll have a bread with a great deal of character as a result of that. I'm going to put in about half of my sourdough starter culture. The other half I'll feed it and maintain it and build it back up again. So that's actually nearly 100 grams of stuff there, but we're just going to ignore that because it's just flour and water. And then 450 grams of just room temperature water. Pouring in slowly because there's a little bit of latency on the display on my scales. And that's all we need to make bread. It's going to make quite a wet mix because that's 90% hydration in baker's percentages. So we're going to start off with a wet, almost a batter. But because this is a wholemeal flour, it's got a lot of bran in there. It's going to suck up a lot of that water. So there we go. You wouldn't even really call that a bread dough to start with. It's more like a porridge. But I'm just going to make sure it's completely and thoroughly mixed. Just have a quick peek underneath. Make sure I've not missed any patches of dry flour. Okay. And I'm just going to cover that and leave it for half an hour at room temperature. And we'll come back and see what it looks like. Okay. 30 minutes has elapsed since we mixed this, so still not going to be possible to knead this, but I'm just going to turn it over. You can see it's starting to come together though. So I'm just going to turn it a few times, like this. And that's it. And I'm just going to leave that now for another half hour. Another half hour has passed. Let's see what's happening now. So yeah, definitely we've got more of a gluten development there. You can see how this is now holding together into a soft, pliable dough. It's still very soft and very wet, but as that moisture works its way into those coarse chunks of roughly milled wheat, we're definitely getting more of a springy sort of texture. So again, I'm just going to give those a couple of folds. We could do this by hand, but spatula seems to be an easier way to get right underneath it without getting in a mess. And you can see it's leaving the bowl clean now, so it's all starting to stick together, and that's because of the gluten development. So just going to fold it over a few times like that. And as I'm doing that, I can feel it starting to tighten up a little bit. So it's actually becoming harder to fold this in half. It's stiffening up a little bit. So cover it up and let it rest for another half hour. Another half hour has passed. Let's see what we've got now. And again, it's just becoming more of a dough now. So you can see it's coming together into a nice ball of coherent dough. And that's just from leaving it. We haven't really done any kneading here. Just moisture and the passage of time will hydrate the gluten in the flour and cause all those gluten strands to get entangled and cross-linked or whatever actually happens. And it doesn't take very long. We could actually almost do the lift and fold thing here, which I'll demonstrate. So one way to do this is actually to lift the whole thing, fold it over, put it down, just with wetted hands. Lift and fold, lift and fold. But just as easy and slightly less messy to do that with a spatula. So that's had 3 sessions of moving around with rests in between. I'm now going to cover that up, and that's going to go in the fridge overnight. So here's my dough after 24 hours in the fridge, and it hasn't risen a lot, but that's fine because it's been in the fridge. I can tell it's actually got some aeration in there because if we tap on the bottom of the bowl, I can tell from the sound it's got a kind of hollow sound to it. I'm going to ferment this for another 24 hours. So what we're just going to do is I'll just wet my hand, get in there, and pick up this dough and fold it over itself a couple of times like this. Pick it up, fold it over. It's obviously too loose and too wet to knead, but we can just fold it over like this. And all we're really doing here is just drawing out those strands of gluten. It's a lovely pliable dough. I think the wheat that they grind at Town Mill is quite strong, so this has got a lot of gluten in it, and that does mean the bread's going to have a lot of structure. Now you can see again it's starting to firm up, and it's not so easy for me to grab hold of the side and actually get it to even fold. So there we go, that's work done for today. That's going to go back in the fridge for a bit more fermentation. First thing tomorrow, as soon as I'm up, I'll get this out and I'll let it come back to room temperature so it can rise before baking. Meanwhile, my sourdough starter is very lively and needs something doing to it again. Now, I'm not planning to keep this sourdough starter going for a long time. That's as much work as having a pet. But I think we will now feed it with some rye flour, which I bought from the shop in Town Mill. So this is the official product from Town Mill, and this is properly milled to a nice fine consistency. So yeah, we've got coarse wheat meal in there at the moment, and we're going to have a couple of big spoons of rye flour, just some water in there. Doing this very much by eye. We'll get to the point where, yeah, that feels like about the right consistency. Now, I might need to transfer that to a bigger bowl if it starts to foam up more than this. There we go, that's as much as that needs for now. I'm just going to let that yeast, well, yeah, I say yeast, it's a sourdough culture, so there's a lot more than just yeast going on in there. But I'll let that feed on that new flour, leave that just out, and we're going to let that develop. So it's day 3, we're going to bake the bread. I've got some oil on this tray. Interestingly, there is no other oil or fat in this bread dough, apart from what's naturally present from the wheat germ. So no particular reason for making this bread without fat, it just happens to be that way. So this has been in the fridge now overnight for 2 nights, and yeah, it smells lovely and sour and yeasty, and I hope it's going to make an interesting loaf. So again, wet hands, and then we're going to gather this up. Now I can feel this has got some air in it, but we're going to lose that when we just work on it now. So I will just do now a lift and fold that way, like that. And then the same this way, lift it up, allow 2 edges to fold down and tuck it underneath. And then again, fold it over itself. And you can see what we've done is built it up. Now it will, as it sits to prove, it will settle back out. I think we'll probably end up, this is quite a wet dough, I think we will end up making quite a flat loaf. So now just gathering it like this and pushing the sides underneath the middle. Something like that. Just wetting my hands to stop them sticking to the dough. And then I'm just going to push that underneath itself like that. And I'm going to leave that for as long as it takes to double in size. This has had a couple of hours, and I'll be perfectly honest with you, when I talked about doubling in size, that's not exactly what I had in mind. This is a really, really loose and relaxed dough, and it's expanded this way instead of this way. Really interesting, because some bakers manage to get their high hydration doughs to stand up really well. I often have this happen. This is absolutely not a problem for today, because we'll just get an interesting flattish loaf. We could even use it as like a medieval trencher. Don't know that I will. But now I could try to tuck that back in and give it its height back. But in doing so, I'd be knocking air out of it and probably end up with quite a dense bake. So I'm just going to leave it be. It's going to go in the oven like that. I'm hoping it will rise to maybe, twice that height or something. I've got the oven preheating to 220 Celsius, and I will drop that down to 180 as soon as I put this in. Quite a thin loaf, so I'll give that half an hour. We'll check on it after that time. But I'm going to turn that down now to 180. So there we go. I wanted rustic, and that's what I got. Lovely crisp crust. I'm going to let that cool on the tray for 5 or 10 minutes before I try to take it off. So that stuck itself down to the tray rather better than I would have liked. I really had some difficulty getting that off. I had to slide a spatula underneath it, and I've lost some of the bottom crust. But we do have a loaf of bread here, of sorts. This top texture is just amazing to look at. You can see all of the different sized little bits of grain and things in there. So I think it's going to be an interesting loaf. I'm going to let it cool completely before I try to slice it. Okay, time to have a look inside. Now, I don't really feel I've done justice to this wonderful rustic coarse flour. This is definitely not my nicest looking loaf of bread ever. But actually, inside it's not bad. Lovely spongy crumb. I won't show you the underneath of this bit because it's completely wrecked. I'm going to cut off a couple of big old chunks there. Really interesting. I think we will assemble a ploughman's lunch. There is a widely repeated myth that the term ploughman's lunch was invented by the Milk Marketing Board in the middle of the 20th century. It's not true. I think they popularised it, but the term definitely existed before that. So I've got my rustic wheatmeal bread, which actually in that presentation doesn't look so bad at all. I don't feel so bad about that now. I've got some Dorset red, which is a smoked cheddar, blue vinny, which is another Dorset cheese, Dorset butter, sadly not a Dorset apple, and the beer that I bought from the brewery at the mill. This is Cobb, which is a session bitter, so it's not too alcoholic. I did also buy a bottle of Dorset Pearl. Lyme Regis is known as the Pearl of Dorset, so aptly named ale, but we're going to open Cobb today, which is of course named for the harbour called the Cobb. Okay, just going to pause and get a picture of that for the thumbnail probably. One more thing that a ploughman should have is some pickle. And this is a Dorset pickle, so this is my pickled wild garlic scapes. This seems an appropriate kind of pickle to have with my ploughmans. So it's basically pickled onions, but not your regular kind of pickled onions. Okay, I wish I could go and sit outside to enjoy my ploughman's lunch, but it's pouring with rain. So we'll go up and have this in the studio, I think. Right then. So, first off, this bread. Like I say, I don't really feel I did the flour justice. Maybe I shouldn't have picked such a high hydration recipe. But it's not bad bread. Let's have a little taste. Taste and texture, excellent. You can definitely feel all of those little bits and pieces of not completely milled grains, little crunchy lumps of grain. And the flavour is just very, very wheaty and nutty and full. And with the addition of a little bit of butter, even better. Now the beer, this is the Cobb Session Bitter. Again, really grainy, malty, slightly fragrant from the hops. That's a fantastic ale, actually. That's a really lovely lunchtime ale. Not too strong, but absolutely crammed with malt and hops. The concept of a ploughman's lunch, I think, was used by the Milk Marketing Board to try to sell dairy products, primarily cheese and butter, in the middle of the 20th century. But being served bread and cheese and ale and butter and pickle in a pub is very, very ancient. These are the things which you probably would have been given if you were a wayfarer, because the production of bread and the production of ale have gone hand in hand for a very long time in human history. A pub that was also a brewery probably would have had a bakehouse next to it, and the barm from the beer would have been used to start the loaves, or vice versa. There is a definite sense here that I'm partaking of a version of a meal that, you know, you could take this meal back. You could take this meal back in time 1,000 years and people would completely recognise it. And there is something about this bread that just really, really intensifies and beautifully carries the flavours of the cheese. So Dorset Blue Vinny is a Dorset cheese, always compared to Stilton, but it is quite different. It's a little bit more pungent, I would say, than Stilton, and that makes it very interesting. And the Dorset Red Cheddar, it's a very lovely smoky cheese. As smoky as a really nice ham, and actually as tasty as. The notionally the star of the show, this rustic, rough grain bread, well worth the wait. I wish it had just been a little bit more photogenic, but we can't have everything, can we? I think it's interesting about how many things in view here are fermented. Obviously, the beer is fermented, cheese is fermented milk, bread is fermented grain, and this is a fermented pickle. The apple and the butter are not fermented. The butter, I suppose, could have been, but it isn't. And it's certainly the case that bread, cheese, pickle and ale would have been things that could be offered in any season of the year, because obviously the bread is a staple made from stored grain, but the cheese, the pickle and the ale are products that would have stored well in the days before refrigeration. So rather than this being a deliberate formula, this would have just been something that was available. But anyway, that has been my trip to Lyme Regis, and as I say, if you happen to be in the area, I think Town Mill is well worth a visit. Maybe don't ask them for the special weird flour. Certainly if you do, don't tell them I said it was okay. I wouldn't like to have created a problem for them. It has been fascinating and rewarding for me to follow this from grains of wheat through to the rough meal, through to the bread, through to the table. I hope it's also been interesting for you. So thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again soon.